So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. First of all, thank you to the International Atlantic Economic Society for this opportunity to meet with all of you and present my research. And I hope we'll have a great 20 minutes ahead. So my name is Maxim Liko, or just Max. I'm a senior currently at the University of Richmond, Virginia. I double major in economics and mathematics. And without further ado, I'm going to share with you some interesting and hopefully important insights about the economic impact of the sanctions imposed by the United States and United Nations. And before I delve into the final outcomes, I'd like to briefly walk you through the process I followed and the motivation that compelled me to investigate this area. So it is known that over the last several decades, sanctions have remained one of the key tools of international politics. And in fact, in the last 30 years, the number of recorded sanctions more than doubled the number of restrictions imposed before 1992. However, when it comes to the ultimate effectiveness, it's been broadly questioned. Considering the major goal of sanctions, which is the desired policy changes in the target countries, whether it's conflict resolution or support of democratic forces or nuclear proliferation prevention, only 30 to 40% of such measures are successful, according to various experts. And when it comes to answering the question of whether sanctions work, meaning whether they lead to the desired policy changes or not, there is a considerable amount of literature on the effect of sanctions on the social and humanitarian aspects in the target states. For instance, it is generally known that such restrictions can lead to reduced access to medicine and education. In addition to that, some studies point out the damaging impact of sanctions on the human rights violations and deteriorated political stability in the target states. And yet, there is relatively scarce empirical research on the economic consequences of sanctions, and specifically the effectiveness of different types of sanctions and their dynamics, which is particularly relevant taking into account the non-homogeneous essence of sanctions. To be more specific, the existing studies mainly focus on regressing a single sanction dummy variable on economic indicators without analyzing what sanction types are most effective and how sanctions impact varies over time. And the studies that do inspect how a given sanction, its classification in a given historical context affects the economic, stability. Those research projects are mostly individual case studies dedicated to one country, so they're lacking the global perspective. So this paper in turn solves these three flaws and aims to both econometrically examine the degree to which sanctions inflict or do not inflict any economic consequence, as well as analyze when such measures are more likely to be effective. And moreover, this study also investigates whether the economic outcomes wane over time, or in other words, how they behave. Are they one-time hit on the economy, or rather a compounding mechanism that works and gives results over time? So to answer those questions and obtain the necessary information for the econometric model, several major sanctions datasets were investigated, from which the global sanctions database was eventually chosen. And I'd like to thank the Lebo College of Business at Drexel University and the Constance University of Applied Sciences in Germany for graciously providing me with access to the data files. So this data set not only monitors if a given country's sanctions, but also gives insights into what sanction types are imposed. I think they divide them into financial, military, trade, travel, arms, and other sanction types. Besides that, it provides the largest sample size compared to the alternatives and encompasses the period of coverage from 1949 to 2023, which is particularly favorable since it includes the data from the most recent significant sanction wave on Russia. I'd like to point out though that this analysis focuses on the period from 1980 to 2023 due to the limited availability of other data points that were obtained from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The real GDP growth was chosen as a major country-specific economic indicator and therefore as a dependent variable for the regression model. In congruence with the questions raised earlier and the dependent variable chosen, The following three hypotheses were formulated in regard to the two sanction groups classified by the two largest sanctioning agents, which are the United States and the United Nations. The first hypothesis is represents the baseline for the further investigation. It looks like the U.S. and the UN sanctions have an adverse effect on the target country's real GDP growth. The second part is based on the assumption that UN sanctions have a stronger effect due to the larger number of countries that are involved in the imposition of restrictions compared to unilateral US sanctions. The second hypothesis focuses on the dynamics of the sanctions effectiveness. The underlying assumption includes the fact that over time, countries are able to adjust to new restrictions by various mechanisms that include switching to alternative trade partners, expanding the shadow economy, maybe recalibrating their imports and exports structure, etc. And the third hypothesis looks specifically at the United States sanctioning activities, as it possesses arguably the highest sanctioning authority in terms of the frequency and magnitude of the sanctions invoked. It aims to analyze the structure of the US sanctions, and since financial sanctions are the most common measures taken by the United States, it's been formulated accordingly, as the US financial sanctions have the largest negative impact on the real GDP growth of the target countries compared to other types of the US sanctions. Finally, the fixed effects two-way model was used to test those assumptions. I was basically choosing, I had panel data, so that's why I was basically choosing between the fixed and random effects model. But after conducting the Hausman test, the random effects model was eliminated. The Hausman test hypothesis was rejected. And I used the two-way model to control for both country-specific and time-specific aspects that could not be controlled otherwise. Different versions of the following baseline equation were estimated in conformity with the stated hypothesis. It is pretty straightforward with the dependent variable, as I already mentioned earlier. It's the annual GDP growth rate. It's already converted to percentage points. The country-specific and time-specific effects, alpha and gamma respectively, account for individual heterogeneity due to unobserved country and time invariant factors, as I again said earlier. Epsilon is obviously a unique error term for each observation. The vector x includes the standard control variables that are used in economic performance modeling. Here I'm using the real GDP, population, degrees of openness, and inflation. And to avoid any issues of reverse causality, the control variables are employed as the forced lag here. And the sanctions vector is a set of dummy variables that are unique to each model specification, which we will see right now, while checking each hypothesis one by one. Starting with the first one, on the slide you can see the two columns that represent outcomes obtained from the model with elect degrees of openness variable, and the second column represents the regression with emitted degrees of openness variable. This was done to account for potential transmission channels through the change in exports and imports after the sanctions are invoked. And both specifications indicate a statistically significant adverse impact of both the US and UN sanctions. The quantitative findings suggest that the sanctioned country's real GDP growth falls by approximately 1.23 percentage points after the US sanctions are imposed, and the UN sanctions lead to the decline in the real GDP growth by approximately 2.67%. The results, I also would like to mention, demonstrate an unsubstantial difference in the size of the effects when the degrees of openness variable is emitted, which could signify that potential volatility in exports and imports does not notably contribute to the negative effect of sanctions. The empirical evidence regarding the second hypothesis is mixed. It's clear from the obtained data that both the US and UN sanctions have the most detrimental effect during the first year of their implementation. At the same time, for the US, the first year's coefficient is the only statistically significant parameter, which may suggest that the sanctions impact is not well traceable in the following years. However, the lack of statistical significance of these values is a limiting factor in interpreting the outcome. Considering the UN sanctions, it's even more interesting. The regression results also indicate the strongest decline during the first year with the drop of the target country's real GDP growth by 3.19 percentage points. In addition to that, a noticeable increase, which is statistically significant in the real GDP growth, is observed during the second year of the UN sanctions imposition, which could potentially be associated with the UN sanction structure in the sanctioned countries' varying reaction to different types of restrictions. Um, and right now, I'm going to use a little bit relatively loose language just to, so to say, allude to potential further study directions, which I think still is important. So when I talk about the structure of the US sanctions, I'll show you a graph. It's a little bit weird, but bear with me. It shows the breakdown of sanction types in their percentage share for a given year. So for instance, in the year of 1977, the UN imposed sanctions which were 50% military sanctions, and the other 50% were the dark green military sanctions, just to give an example. And if you take a look at the military travel and arms sanctions, if I combine them all, they jointly account for a significant portion of the measures taken by the United Nations. And having an assumption that defense sector of the economy is usually viewed and perceived by the states as of critical existential importance, the sanctioned countries are more prone to react more elastically compared to other sanction types to this sanctioned classes. Um, and since the UN sanctions consistently have the largest component of this three types of sanctions, this might be the reason, versus the other sanction types such as financial and trade restrictions, which are in turn one of the key components of the UN sanctions. So here again, if I combine them all, they're consistently the largest share of sanctions imposed by the United States, and we don't have such a drastic positive change in the second year for the US sanctions. Again, just to note, those were more of a speculatory, intuitive points that were not the main focus of this paper, but I think it's still important for the further study directions. Okay, I have a few more minutes to discuss the last part. And it's the third hypothesis. The quiet results generally support the assumption with a strong statistical significance financial sanctions imposed by the US have the most negative impact on the target country's real GDP growth. However, all other sanction types did not produce any statistically significant coefficients, which is a limiting factor in interpreting the outcomes. This might indicate that military trade, travel, and arms sanctions do not lead to a significant change in the target country's real GDP growth, especially considering their absolute values, which are all less than 1%, except for the arms sanctions effect, which again could be explained by the intrinsic nature of the sort of sanctions as I explained earlier for the UN sanctions. To sum it up, the paper's results suggest that both the US and UN sanctions have a negative impact on the target state's economic growth, with the UN sanctions having a stronger adverse effect with 2.67 percentage points, and the US imposed sanctions leading to the target country's real GDP growth decline by 1.21 percentage points. The time-relevant dynamics investigation demonstrates that both the US and UN sanctions have the most profound negative effect during the first year of their implementation. And finally, the structural analysis of the US sanctions indicates that financial restrictions are the most powerful tool among other types of the US sanctions. So Going back to the big picture, the study shows that despite the recently increased skepticism around the effectiveness of international sanctions, such measures do lead to target countries' deterioration, target countries' economies' deterioration, with its certain limits, as I shown above. At the same time, according to the existing literature discussed at the beginning, it is clear that even when such measures lead to economic damage for the target countries, they do not always lead to the desired policy changes. So the next logical step would be further analysis into the connection between the economic consequences and the policy changes, in which this study results would be useful, I hope. And on that note, I think I give stage back to the moderator, and I'm looking forward to your questions.